everybody, I'm Cindy Overton. Welcome to our purchase agreement contract class. Just to let you know, this is one of those classes that's a lot more technical. It's kind of a nuts and bolts class, but if you're a new agent, you're probably going to be working with buyers most of all when you get started. So you really need to know what's in this agreement. We're going to go through it paragraph by paragraph, step by step, and basically give you kind of a real world understanding of what's in this document so that you have an understanding so you can explain it to your client. Now, first and foremost, every manager is going to tell you, you need to read this document, because if you don't know what's in it, how can you explain it to your client, okay? There's lots of ways you can access this document. There are hard copies printed off in every office. They're in sales file packets, and it's also available on Instanet. So get a copy, read it, try to understand it. If you've got questions, go to see your manager. When you're working with your buyers, I also recommend you give them a blank copy early on in the process so they can read it. They will have questions about it. You can get ahead of those. So we're going to dive right in. But before we get started, one other document I want to mention is the contract checklist. This is also available in your sales packet. It's also available on Instanet. Keep these handy, get familiar with it. These blanks have all the pieces of information that you need to complete this contract. If you get these pieces of information, you've got the data that you need. There's nothing more embarrassing than leaving your client thinking you've got everything you need and then sitting at your computer to type up the offer, and next thing you know, you're shooting off about 5 texts asking, oh, what did you want to do about the inspection? What did you want to do about the home warranty? Which closing company do you want to use? Just makes you look a whole lot more professional if you can get all of this information up front. So find that contract checklist and use that as well. All right, so now we're going to dive right into the purchase agreement. First thing I want to mention is that it is a legally binding document. Now that seems kind of obvious, but you need to understand that. You need to stress that with your client. It's the very first thing written right under the heading. And in this day and age, folks just don't seem to take that seriously. They think they can go out, get caught up in the emotion of looking at a house, make an offer, and then say, oh, I've changed my mind. That is not true. It is a legally binding document. And there's also another little phrase there that says, if not understood, seek competent advice. That means an attorney. We need you to remember, you are not an attorney. If you understand this, yes, you are duty bound to explain it, but if they start picking this contract apart, that's when you refer them to an attorney. Okay, so remember those two things. The first paragraph there talks about the date and who the buyer is and who the sellers are. The date that you use is the date you're writing the agreement. The purchaser is your buyer's name and how they want the property titled. The seller, that is the seller of the property. Make sure you have all the owners. That can be a little more complicated than you would think. You can get that information from the MLS listing or the tax records. If you've got any questions, the listing agent should be able to help you. The next 2 blanks talk about who the brokers are that are representing each party. That is the company. Do not put your name, do not put my name as the office manager. You would put Hometown Realty as the broker representing the purchaser. Then we move on to paragraph 1. That's titled Real Property. That's where you are describing the property that is being purchased. You want to clearly identify the property as best you can. Tax parcel ID number is the most specific identification. That's also available in the MLS or in the tax records. And the line there that says more commonly known as, that's where you put the street address. Okay? Now let's move on to personal property included. As you know from taking your real estate classes, the personal property is typically things that are not attached to the real property. If things are attached, they typically convey. I recommend you read this paragraph and get familiar with the different items that are listed, but remember that's not all inclusive. And if there's ever any question about something, if you're not sure if something conveys, you're better off doing overkill and being specific. A couple of real world examples that we see real often are with today's wall-mounted TVs. People see a TV on the wall, they think, oh, well, it's on the wall, it's attached, it's going to convey. The mount is attached to the wall, so you would expect that to convey, but the TV doesn't automatically convey. Now, you can still ask for that TV. You can ask for anything you want, but that doesn't automatically convey. If your buyer wants to ask for that, if they want to ask for a piece of furniture, if they want to ask for the drapes, you need to write those items in this paragraph. Now, one thing to remember, if your client's getting a loan, especially if it's a government loan, FHA, VHDA, USDA, the appraisers don't really want personal property included as part of the contract. So you're better off putting that kind of items on a bill of sale. If you do put them here, or even if it's a conventional loan and you include them here, just make sure you add that phrase, at no added value. Okay? One thing I want to add here, your manager should have a copy of this contract filled in with some of these little cheat sheet notes. Make sure you ask them for that, and that way you can keep that handy with you too, to help you with these practical examples of what you need to fill in on your contract. But that phrase, at no added value, just helps the appraiser know they don't need to include or worry about that personal property. Paragraph 3 are the different addenda that you might have to attach. We don't have time to cover those in this particular class, just know those are some special situations, and you just check the box if you are attaching those different addenda. The most common is the lead-based paint, which applies to homes built before '78, and the right of first refusal. All right, we're going to move on to paragraph 4, purchase price. This is where you're putting the price your buyer's offering for the property, and you're filling in the terms of the loan if they are paying for it with a loan. So you fill this out numerically and in words, just like when you're filling out a check. Then that first box there says the sale is not subject to financing. Purchaser shall pay all cash. Now that seems pretty obvious, but in this day and age, it's really not. I want you to remember cash is only cash if it's theirs. It's not Uncle Joe's. It's not, oh, Uncle Joe's going to give me the money for this house in 2 weeks. It's not, I'm getting one of those like personal loans. Because sometimes a buyer thinks, if I'm not getting a mortgage, then it's cash. So they tell you, oh yeah, I'm paying cash for it. Unless they have the cash in an account in their name that's accessible, it's not cash. And you need to verify that. You need to ask for what's called a proof of funds. So keep that in mind. The next paragraph is if they're getting a loan. And it says this sale is subject to financing. And you check the box for the type of loan they're getting. The boxes underneath there aren't as much necessary to be filled out. It talks about the rate and if they're paying points and things like that. But those only survive until application, so they're not as critical. Now you're probably thinking, well, how do I know that information? This is where you should be talking to your buyer's lender. You shouldn't be taking any buyers out that have not been pre-qualified by a lender. So they should be sending you a pre-qualification letter, and that letter should tell you the type of loan, how much they're putting down, whether they need closing assistance. When your buyer's ready to make that offer, you need to be having a conversation with that lender, and they will help you fill out this paragraph. The bottom paragraph there talks about the loan shall be amortized over a certain number of years. Most people are still doing 30-year loans, and most people aren't asking for any discount points. The very bottom paragraph there talks about closing cost and whether or not the seller is going to pay towards any of the buyer's closing cost. There's a blank there that you can fill in. Again, that's where you talk with the lender and see how your client needs the deal to be structured. Please remember, my note on your cheat sheet says, be close to reality. It does you no good to get the seller to agree to pay $12,000 in closing cost if the real closing costs are only $8,000. Your buyer then can't use those funds, and you've basically given the seller $4,000 more. So make sure those estimates are close to reality. Your lender can help with that. And typically a good ballpark estimate is about 3% of the purchase price. All right, we're going to turn the page to paragraph 5, appraisal. That's another check the box. The sale is or is not subject to the property's appraised value equaling or exceeding the purchase price. Now, if they're getting a loan, the lender is always going to require an appraisal. So they're always going to do one. But depending on your buyer's situation, the sale may not be subject to it. Now, what does that mean? That means if they've got some cash to work with, they may be able to offer a little bit higher price because they can make up the difference. Let's say the house only appraises for $250. The bank's going to loan the percentage, whether it's 80%, 90%, off of that $250. But if your buyer has some extra cash to work with and they've offered $255, they might have that extra $5,000 if the house appraises low. So again, that's where you talk with your lender, talk with your client. You need to understand what their situation is. Most first-time buyers that you work with, they're going to be strapped for cash. So typically you would check that box. It is subject to appraisal. Most of them don't have extra cash to bring to the table. So you want to protect them by making sure that their property appraises for the price that they're offering. I've also circled on here that the appraisal needs to be ordered within 15 days of ratification. And I've referred you to paragraph 27 where ratification is defined. Take note that that is when everything is signed and delivered. That means you've gotten that last initial and you've sent it back to the listing agent on the other side. Don't let it sit in your email and think you'll get it to them on Monday morning, because it's technically not a fully ratified deal till the other side has it back. You don't want your client missing out because someone else has snuck in and finalized a contract. Okay? I'm going to skip over the next part about appraisal, but get familiar with that paragraph. It's just talking about what happens and what your options are if the property does not appraise. In general, there's a process. You have to make a written request to have the seller adjust their sales price down to the appraised value, and there is a process to go through there. We're going to move on now to paragraph 6, financing. So this is if the purchaser is getting a loan. The thing you need to remember and stay on top of is that the purchaser shall make written application for their loan within 7 days. Now today, most times people have gotten pre-qualified, they've pretty much done their loan application. So when they find that house that they make the offer on, they've usually got their application in the works. But you do need to stay on top of that deadline. Also, it gives you some deadlines about settlement. If the buyer does not get loan commitment by 5 p.m. on the settlement date, then the seller does have the right to terminate. So just stay on top of it. Let your buyer know they need to fully cooperate with their lender so that these loans can get closed on time. Okay? One other thing buyers always ask, can I get out of this if I don't get my loan? That's what the last sentence of this paragraph says. Now, we're not in the business of breaking contracts. We like to keep deals together. But if for some reason, even though they've been pre-qualified, something comes up during the underwriting process and they do not get approved for the loan, then yes, that is one situation where the buyer can be released. If they cannot get financing after they've done everything they need to do, then they can be released from the contract and their deposit can be refunded to them. Paragraph 7 is just an informational disclosure paragraph. It just warns both buyer and seller to be very careful and be aware of wire fraud. I'm sure you've heard things in the news about people losing large sums of money because they wired money to the wrong account. Your buyer will be given instructions by the settlement attorney about how and where to send their funds that are needed for closing. They should not deviate from those instructions at all. If they get any other kind of email, they should call their settlement attorney and just be very careful about what they do with their funds. All right, let's move on to paragraph 8, the deposit. Your buyer's going to need to make a deposit. You're given a couple of options there, check, cash, and other. And I really wish they would take the box that says cash out of the contract. You do not want to accept cash as an earnest money deposit. Number one, we don't want cash in the office. Number two, lenders don't like cash deposits. They cannot verify or source where that deposit came from. And everything with getting a loan is about documenting and verifying and sourcing. So remember, no cash. They don't really like money orders either for the same reason. And in this day and age, a lot of folks do not carry their checkbooks with them. People under 30 don't even know what a checkbook is. So plan for that. There are lots of ways around that. You can take them to their bank. They can get a counter check or a cashier's check right from their bank. There's also a couple other options right here in the contract. You've got 2 more boxes, has paid the deposit or will pay the deposit. Only check that first box that says has paid if your client is giving you the deposit the day you're with them. If they're going to give it, if you're out with them on Saturday and they're going to bring it to you on Monday or Tuesday, then you use the will pay and you put 3 days or 4 days. Just remember that is technically a contingency of your contract and you've got to follow up on that. Do not forget to collect it. Don't let your client forget to drop it by the office. It's just one more thing you need to plan on, giving them instructions on the deposit. If you're buying new construction, builders typically require larger deposits, and a lot of times the builder holds the deposit. If you're buying a foreclosure or something at auction, they have very specific instructions with regards to the amount and who's holding it. But for your typical resale, you as the buyer's agent are usually the one to collect the deposit. It's made out to Hometown Realty. We don't typically see large deposits around here. Sometimes it's as much as 1%, but $500 to $1,000 is still very often what we see on homes up to $350,000, $400,000. There's mixed feelings on that. If they make a bigger deposit, they've got more skin in the game. They're less likely to just get a wild hair and try to get out of the deal, because they're risking losing that deposit. So there's that train of thought. But typically, $1,000 is a very normal amount that we see for a deposit. Now, I've got some notes written on here as well about don't play around with that deposit. And our company policy is we want you to turn it in within 2 days of when it is in your hands, because escrow rules require us as the escrow agent to have it in the bank within 5 days. So just don't play around with deposits, be serious about them, make sure you collect them, make sure you get them turned in timely. Okay, go on to the next page, paragraph 9, settlement or possession. Settlement shall be made at the offices of, that's where they choose their closing attorney or settlement agent. You let them know it is always up to the buyer to choose. Maybe they've had somebody they've worked with in the past. If they haven't, you can always recommend our business partner, Joe Perini at MG Law and Home Title Company. But again, it's always up to the buyer. You have 2 choices here. The first box says we're going to close at on this date or a reasonable time thereafter. And the second box is a little tighter deadline. It says we're going to close on this date, or if we haven't closed within 10 days of that date, the party who is willing and able has the right to terminate. I've always used the first one. It's more general, and especially if I'm representing the buyer, it just gives you a little leeway. But I've seen so many problems with sellers getting kind of jerked around by buyers who aren't doing what they're supposed to do. I've become a bigger fan of the second one because it does give you a specific deadline. Doesn't say you have to terminate. If everybody's trying to get everything done and you've just run into some circumstances, maybe there have been some delays in getting information that the underwriters need, but everybody's trying to do what they're supposed to do. Most folks want to stay in the deal and keep things moving along. But at least that protects the seller from the buyer who is not doing what they're supposed to do. Sometimes buyers try to change lenders midway through or change the type of loan, which they really cannot do or should not do, but sometimes that happens. So if you're representing the buyer, you tend to favor the first option because it gives you a little more leeway. Sellers might like that second one. So you'll just, as you develop your business, you'll decide which one you prefer. The next paragraph is another one of those that seems fairly obvious. Possession of the property shall be given at settlement unless otherwise agreed upon by the parties. Believe it or not, we can all share a lot of war stories. We had an agent who had a buyer that just did not understand that, and he thought as soon as he wrote the contract, he could just move into that house, and he actually climbed in through a window and set up camp in the house. So just, even though it's obvious, make sure you explain to your client that until they have had their closing and their settlement, the house is not theirs. Paragraph 10, occupancy. This is mainly for the lender. It helps them know what to do with processing the loan. It just says the purchaser intends to occupy or not occupy the property as their principal residence, so you just check a box there. Paragraph 11, residential property disclosure. This is a standard form that is required. You're going to check some boxes. Seller represents that the property is or is not subject to the property disclosure, and then you check a box whether it is or is not attached. Now this is one of those forms that, because it's so commonplace and so required, everybody tends to not give it the respect that it deserves. It is very important. If it is not provided, the buyer can walk, this is one place where the buyer can walk away from the deal right up to closing. What I need you to remember as representing a buyer, this is a form and a disclosure that is provided by the seller. I see new agents all the time getting eager. They're just going down their checklist and filling out forms, and they turn in a property disclosure that is blank, not signed by the seller, but is just signed by their buyer. That is incorrect. This is a disclosure provided by the seller. It's basically just saying that the home is safe and inhabitable, doesn't provide a whole lot of other disclosure, and that's why people don't think a whole lot about it. I've never seen one that has really disclosed anything of any real valuable information, but it is still something that comes from the seller to the buyer. Good listing agents will attach it to the listing in MLS. When you look in MLS under the picture, there's a little icon that looks like sheets of paper. That is where the attachments are. Under that attachment, there will be any disclosures from the seller to the buyer. You can download those and have your client sign them. And one of those is the property disclosure. The box here about saying it is or is not attached, if the listing agent has not provided it to you at the time you're making your offer, you would mark it's not attached. You still need to get it, but it's not attached to the offer that you're submitting. Paragraph 12, fair housing disclosure. That's a standardized generic disclosure that just says all offers will be presented and considered without regard to race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, elderliness, or national origin. So that's just a standard disclosure in our contract. The next two paragraphs kind of go hand in hand. Paragraph 13 is for Property Owners Association disclosure, and paragraph 14 is the condominium disclosure. Paragraph 14 is exactly the same information, it just applies to condominiums, and the documents are called resale certificates. For the Property Owners Association, what you need to remember when you're representing the buyer is a few things. Number one, it's coming from the seller. Again, this is something the seller provides to your buyer, okay? They have to give you something that is up to date and current. Do not let them hand you the old copy that's in their seller's desk drawer. Because things could have changed. There could be violations that the seller has not taken care of, depending on how restrictive the HOA association is. There's also timelines in here that you need to, that's your main job, to be really cognizant of those timelines. These are provided by, like I said, the seller, and sometimes they come from big association management groups, property management groups. So sometimes it can take 2 or 3 weeks to get these, which is really kind of ridiculous, but because it comes by email, and it's usually just a link to a bunch of documents. But when it comes from the seller, and it's going to come through the listing agent, it'll come to you, the buyer's agent. Once it hits your email, that is when this timeline starts. And your client has 3 days. It refers in here to a 3-day right of rescission. But that clock's going to start when it hits your email. So you need to be in communication with the listing agent, document your timeline so that everybody's on the same page, so that you know when you've received it. You also need to immediately deliver it to your client. How awful would it be if you went away and it sat in your email for 3 days and you got it to your client on day 4 or 5 and there was something in there that they really did not like that would make them not want the property, but their 3 days is wasted because you missed the email. So this is very, very critical. You've got lots of tools to help you stay on top of that. I start a checklist when I have a new contract. I either write it on the outside of the folder if I'm going old school. You can use AuthentiSign, which is our electronic signing, to document when you've delivered it to your client, when you've received it from the listing agent. There are forms in Instanet to document all those deadlines, or you can just use email. But come up with some way to stay on top of those deadlines. This is very critical. Now, another point of practice here that I want to share with you. Like I said, we're in the business of keeping deals together, but just understand this is one place where a buyer can get out of a contract very easily. When they get that document, that disclosure from the Property Owners Association, they do not have to say why they want out, what they don't like. Just at some point during that 3 days, they can say, yep, there's something in there I don't like, I want out of the deal. So keep that in mind whenever you're working with a buyer, or even if you're a listing agent and you're selling a property that has a property owner's disclosure. The reason I say that, let's say you're doing your home inspection and it's become very difficult, you're not able to come to terms. Even though they can't really use the home inspection per se to get out of the deal, if that HOA packet's going to be delivered in the next week, they're just going to use that as an excuse to get out of the deal. If you're not coming to terms here, next week they're going to get out of the deal. So you may as well just cut your losses, let them out at the home inspection if you're not able to come to a good agreement, and move on. Because that is the one place that's the easiest for the buyer to get out of the deal. I would not be publicizing that. When you're working with buyers, like I said, you want them to stay in the deal. But just know that that can happen. In that 3-day period, all they have to say is, yep, I've read the HOA packet and I want out of the deal. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Now I'm going to skip down to paragraph 15. Another thing related to these HOA packets is the Owners Association repairs. This was a relatively new addition to our contract, and it's very important. The other reason you want to stay on top of that packet and make sure it's a current packet is I mentioned the violations. I was very lucky. I almost got burned on this, but it wasn't too bad. Somebody was looking out for me and I got caught. First couple of deals I did, I just got the links, I forwarded on to my client. I didn't even look at it to see what was in there. Because there's going to be a financial page that talks about the dues and whether they're paid up on their dues and things like that. I didn't even know there was a page that talked about the inspection and whether or not there were things the seller needed to fix to be in compliance. And luckily, like I said, I didn't get caught on any of those. Then on a deal a year or so into the business, I suddenly realized, oh wow, there's a page here that talks about things that the seller needs to do. Again, I was kind of lucky because they were pretty minor. It was like painting a mailbox or putting a decal on a mailbox. So nothing too significant, things that I could have easily taken care of. But if there's something major there that you want the seller to be responsible for before your buyer takes possession, now our contract states the purchaser has to request in writing within 5 days of getting the disclosure packet if they want the seller to fix any of those. And if they don't make a written request within 5 days, they waive their chances to do that. So any violations at closing then become the responsibility of the buyer. So that is another deadline that you really need to stay on top of and be aware of. So when you get that link, there's going to be links to a lot of documents. You want to click through and look to the one that has the inspection report and any violations that might need to be addressed. Okay, now the big one, property inspection, home inspection. This is probably the most difficult, most contentious part of any deal. And it's so involved that we have a whole class just on home inspections. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about timelines, the overview, the general idea that you need to have about home inspections. It's another one of the areas where you as the buyer's agent need to really stay on top of timelines because there are consequences to not doing that. In general, your job here is to keep everybody calm, to educate your buyer, and to set the right expectations. Remember, we want to keep the deal together. So when you're taking a buyer out, don't say, oh yeah, we can get out at the home inspection. That's the wrong expectation to set. You do tell them, yes, you're protected by the home inspection. If we find out there's something wrong with the property, we have the opportunity to go back to the seller and get it fixed. That's a whole different thing than saying we can walk away. Anything we find, we will have the seller address it. Okay, so that's a different way of thinking. You also need to remind them they're shopping for a used house, just like you're shopping for a used car. It's not going to be perfect. You need to educate them on the difference between a true defect, something that's not working, like a leaking roof, a leaking toilet, some other system that's not working. That's different than a cosmetic defect. That's different than something that's old, like a roof at the end of its life that's not leaking. That's still a fine roof. Now, the appraiser might have a comment about it, and that's a different issue. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But if it's old but still working, that's not a defect. Theoretically, those type of issues were taken into account when they priced the house. The house with the old roof and the old HVAC should not be priced as high as the one where they've updated all those things. So first and foremost, educate your buyer, set the right expectations. We're going to check this property out, we're going to look for defects, and we're going to get the seller to address anything that we find. Okay, the other thing to remember, and this is where you need to get to know your client a little bit, the time period that you're going to set for the inspection, that is your one time period to do every inspection. So I recommend if you've set a 15-day time period, you try to schedule your general home inspection as early in that 15 days as you can, because you may need to do some follow-up. The home inspector might say, there's something going on with the roof, but I'm not sure exactly what's causing it. So you might have to get a roofer out there. Same with the HVAC. They may say it's not testing exactly right, but they're not going to diagnose the problem. You may have to get an HVAC contractor out there. If your client is concerned about radon, that's a separate inspection. If they're concerned about lead, if it's an old house that might have lead paint. So any and all inspections have to be done during this one time period. You can't keep dragging it out and tacking them on. So you need to have those conversations with your client, find out what's important to them, what they're going to want to get checked out, and get it all done during that time period. Flip the page, and this kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of what you're responsible for and the timelines. So first, the timeline. Typical is 10 to 15 days. you can do it one of two ways. You can say we're going to do it so many days after ratification, or give a specific date. Two schools of thought. If you do the number of days after ratification, that gives you more flexibility, because let's say you submit the offer on Friday, you end up negotiating back and forth, everything's not finalized till Sunday afternoon, your 15 days starts Sunday afternoon. So that's fine. But sometimes we all get a little confused. There's a little gray area about, well, when did we get that last initial? So if you go with that one, you send an email, do something to the listing agent to make sure everybody's on the same page of when your timeline starts. So there's no contention on the other end of when the 15 days ends, okay? If you do the specific date, that's clear cut. Like, we're gonna do everything by 5 p.m. on the 15th. But remember the scenario I just mentioned. If you waste 3 days negotiating your offer, make sure you change that date. You don't want your 15 days to be cut down to 12 because you've spent 3 of them negotiating the offer. So either way, just choose a way, keep it up to date based on your negotiation times, and then make sure you get your inspections done. Now, when you do the inspection, you as the buyer's agent are going to provide 3 things to the listing agent and the seller, and those are listed in the first sentence there. You're going to provide an actual copy of the inspection report, a cost of the repairs to be done, which is on your written repair request. So those two kind of go hand in hand. When the inspector does the report, you're going to get some of these reports are 50 pages long. It's going to go system by system, item by item. It's going to include pictures, and then there's going to be a summary. Usually your repair request comes from the summary. And the inspector is going to lay out for you, these are the things we found, and here's our estimate of what it's going to cost to fix it. Now, you need to be careful. I'm seeing a bigger trend with inspectors not giving you that cost to cure, that cost of repair. Per our contract, you have to provide that. So that's where I was saying you might need to get that roofer out there or that HVAC guy out there. You can't send it over with, seller, I want you to check out the HVAC and tell me what's going on. Our contract used to allow for that, but it specifically says now, seller does not have to do any of these inspections. If you want that HVAC checked out or repaired, you need to have somebody look at it, come up with the specific diagnosis of what you think the problem is, and an estimate of the cost to fix it. So don't send something over with just HVAC didn't test right, check it out. I've got an agent in my office that she says when she receives that on a repair addendum, that's the first thing she marks out that her seller's not going to do. So make sure you have those 3 items. If you forget to fill in the blank of the timeline, it's going to default to 10 days. And I will just tell you now, inspectors have been so busy, it's hard to get everything done in 10 days. Sometimes you can, but 10 to 15 days is the norm. Okay, let me think what else I wanted to mention there. I've already talked about doing the inspection as soon as possible. Seller's not required. Okay, so that's the first step, getting everything done and sending it over. Now, I just want to briefly mention foreclosures or as-is purchases. We sometimes see those, especially as competitive as the market has been here lately. That's one thing buyers sometimes offer. They say, well, I'm going to do an inspection, but I'm going to, as long as the house isn't too bad, if there's things that aren't any worse than what I can see looking at it, I'll take the house as is, and I'm not going to ask the seller for any repairs. And what the part they forget is to add the phrase, but I reserve the right to terminate if I don't like what I see. That's not in our contract. You would need to add that in the other terms. I've just found out our contract is going to be revised probably around October 1, maybe November. That language may be added as an option. So watch for that, look for that. That would be really great if it was in there. And that's a typical thing that buyers are doing in competitive situations. Either giving up a certain dollar amount, like I'm going to do my inspection, as long as I don't find anything more than $2,500 or $5,000 worth of repairs, I'm going to take the house as is. Those are all little clauses you can add into the other terms. So just remember that if you run into a situation like that, need some guidance, go see your manager, get some help on language. But the typical way you do it is you do your inspection, you turn in the 3 things. You have to do the 3 things: the report, the repairs, and the estimate of the cost to fix. So you send that over. Then we're going to go down to this middle paragraph on the page. The next phase is called the negotiation period. This is where the timeline comes into play. So your first timeline is the number of days you put in that top paragraph. You send everything over within that time period. Then the 7-day negotiation period begins. That's where buyer and seller are going to try to come to terms. So maybe your summary showed 20 items that the inspector found. You need to sit down with your buyer, figure out what's the most important. Everything's a negotiation. I always tell people, if you won the battle on price, like maybe you got them to give you some closing costs, maybe they knocked off a little bit of the sales price, then don't expect to win the battle here on inspection. They've given you some money already, so keep that in mind when you're asking them for repair items. Go for the big items. Also take into consideration your client's background and abilities. Maybe they're a handy person, maybe things don't bother them as much, like maybe they can fix a leaky faucet, even though that is something that needs to be fixed. Maybe that's something that they can handle themselves. So you negotiate over the next 7 days which things you really want to ask for. And as a point of practice, sometimes that's done by email. Definitely the first thing has to all be done in writing per the contract. You can sometimes have phone conversations, emails, but ultimately everything has to be agreed upon in writing, signed off on by both parties. Now sometimes sellers either just don't want to deal with it, and they'll offer you a credit. They'll offer your buyer a closing credit instead of doing the specific repairs. That's fine as long as you have room for that credit. If you've already received the maximum closing cost as part of your initial offer, you don't have room for any more closing cost. So they're going to have to do the repairs. So every deal's different. You need to understand the specifics of your contract and work things out that way. Just make sure it's all in writing and you have 7 days to come to terms. Now let's say you get to the end of that 7th day, you haven't reached an agreement. There's still 2 more days per the contract where the buyer can then decide what they want to do. They can accept the seller's last offer, or they have until 5 p.m. on that 2nd day to get out of the deal if they can't come to terms. So when you think about it, we're trying to do closings in 30 days. If you had 15 days to do your inspection, and then 7 days to negotiate, and then 2 more for the buyer to decide to stay in, we're now at 24 days. Hopefully by now people are pretty invested in this deal, both buyer and seller. Hopefully you can use that as good motivation for people to work things out, come to an agreement, and make things keep rolling along. All right, like I said, the inspection is the toughest part of the deal. We'll do a whole class on that. Just remember deadlines, the 3 things you have to provide, and if you're going to do any type of as-is where you want to get out, you need to put that language in there and be specific about it. Okay. Paragraph 17. This is the default paragraph. This is one of those paragraphs, read it, have your client read it, and just tell them this is standard legal jargon. It talks about what happens if either party defaults. You can be liable for broker's fees and legal fees and things like that. I always just brush right past it and say, but we're not going to have that. Everybody's going to do what they're supposed to do. Because the reality is, it's very time-consuming, costly, and it's very hard to collect. So very seldom does anything get pursued, but it is in there, and you do let them know that they can be responsible for a lot of other fees if they default on a contract. Paragraph 18 is choice of settlement agent. That's more standard language, but it is letting them know, as we mentioned in an earlier paragraph, the buyer gets to choose who they want to use to close their transaction. Paragraph 19 is the brokerage fee. That's the commission. This is where it says that the seller authorizes the settlement agent to pay both brokers and to share the closing documents with both brokers. Also says the commission is not part of the contract. You will quickly learn the commission is always part of the contract. Sometimes to make a deal work, you'll be asked to cut your commission if you're having problems getting inspection items worked out or things like that. You know, we encourage you not to do that. It's a last resort, but you will sometimes have to do that to make a deal work. If you need advice, go consult with your manager. They will help you figure that one out. All right, paragraph 20, home warranty insurance. Get familiar with our home warranty. We have a really good rep. She always goes to bat for us and tries to help us get things worked out. The importance of this paragraph is that you check one of these boxes. It says the purchaser has been advised of the availability of a warranty and either elects to purchase it or declines. I really don't care. I do care that you've marked a box, and there's a couple of reasons. It protects you, and it protects us at Hometown, and it keeps our errors and omissions insurance rates down. Because what this is it just lets me know that you have discussed this with your client. I don't really care whether they take the warranty or not. New construction, they're getting a warranty from the builder, so you would just check decline. That's a little different situation. They're not going to buy this home warranty. They're getting a warranty from the builder. Some situations it's not necessary. The home's in good shape. Maybe they're trying to save the $500 or $600. But I do need to know that you've discussed it with them and offered it to them. So if you do not check a box here, this is one time you will get a note from me as a manager when I've reviewed your file, and I just need to know that you've had that conversation. And rather than open your contract back up, I'm going to have you take the home warranty application to them, and they can just waive coverage on the warranty at that time. Warranties, they're just like any other type of insurance. They give you a little bit of peace of mind. They don't cover everything. They have a deductible. You have to use their contractors, so it's just a little bit of peace of mind. Typically, as a buyer, you're asking the seller to provide it. That's the next box. You mark who's going to pay for it. Again, this spring, when things were super competitive and people were, in competitive offer situations, that's one thing buyers were giving up. They might still get the warranty, but they wouldn't ask the seller to pay for it. They were trying to make their offer as competitive as possible, so they thought, well, that's $600 I can pay myself. So it just kind of depends on your situation, who's going to pay for it. As a listing agent, I'll flip over to that side for a minute. I tell my sellers, if you're concerned about something breaking on your home while it's listed, maybe they want to take that warranty out, because it does give them coverage during the listing period at no cost, and it doesn't get paid for until closing. Then that's something they can offer to the buyer. So always look in the MLS and see if the seller's already offering it. Some sellers do offer it up front, so then you know that's something that you can put into the contract and your buyer can ask for. All right, paragraph 21, related businesses and services. That's just a disclosure that says we as a broker may have affiliated partners, which we do. Our insurance company, our title company, and Town First, our lender. That's a disclosure form that you have to get your client to sign. That's called our affiliated business disclosure. That's in your sales packet. Paragraph 22 is a disclosure from your purchaser. That's saying that this is not a contingent offer. The purchaser does not have any other real estate that they have to sell in order to buy this real estate. Okay? Paragraph 23, additional terms. This is where you write in any other terms of the contract. If you need more room, you can add a blank addendum page. Some notes that I've made here, make sure it's legible, both handwriting and if you're doing it on the computer. Don't go below an 8-point font. You're not able to see it if you do. Always use this mindset, if then. I see all the time, seller to do such and such, but it doesn't say what's going to happen if the seller doesn't do that, or it doesn't have a deadline. And so then that's when you run into problems. Somebody doesn't do what's stated in the contract, but no resolution is in the contract. So then you're in limbo. One side wants to get out, there's no easy resolution, and there's this huge gray area. So always when you're writing other terms into your contract, think if then. We want this to happen, and it's going to happen by this deadline. If it doesn't, this is how we're going to resolve it. We're going to terminate, we're going to extend, whatever. You know, there's plenty of people in the office, your manager, other experienced agents, because believe me, you will run into situations that some people haven't seen. We may have to put our heads together and come up with it. That's the nice thing about this business. Every day is different, every transaction is different. Some things are pretty common, and we're going to have a class on clauses and situations that come up real often. But this is where you put in that as is, like we're going to do our inspection, take the house as is, but if it's unsatisfactory, we reserve the right to terminate. There's other things that come up, like we're going to waive the first dollar amount of home inspection. Oil tanks, sometimes if older homes have underground oil tanks, there's a recommended language we use there. The whole thing about contingencies. This is subject to the sale and settlement of such and such property, which is currently under contract and scheduled to close on this date. If it doesn't close by this date, then seller reserves the right to terminate or whatever. Whatever you want it to be. This is also where you can talk about other things you want conveying. Maybe there's trash in the yard you want cleaned up. Anything you want. Maybe you're walking through the house and you notice, but even before you get to the home inspection, there's a water stain on the ceiling that you want painted, or you want a fence repaired. You can put things like that here. So that's pretty much anything can be written there. All right, the next section is a whole bunch of standard provisions. What I recommend is that you get very familiar with them so that you can explain them to your client kind of in bullet point fashion. Be brief, and this is another one of those areas. If they start having detailed questions, you recommend they speak to an attorney, because this is canned legal jargon and you can explain what it means, but if they want to start pulling it apart, rewriting it, that's when you say, I'm not an attorney, but I can give you a name for one. Paragraph A, expense prorations. The seller is going to cover the cost of preparing the deed and the grantor's tax. And then the last line in the paragraph talks about certain expenses that are prorated, fuel, oil, and taxes. Now, most people understand the taxes and they don't think twice about that, but people don't think about fuel oil. Funny story we had in our office, our agent was the listing agent. Buyer's agent on the other side was pretty inexperienced. He had not prepared his client for the fact that they would have to pay for any oil in the tank. And that can be a significant number, depending on the time of year, how recently the tank was filled, first-time buyer. So they had another $300 or $400 added to their closing statement that they weren't expecting. So he calls in and says, oh yeah, my client, I don't want that oil, can you take it out of the tank? Well, of course they can't, and also my agent just kind of laughed and said, read your contract. He should have prepared his buyer that that's just an expense of buying a house, and you need to have a little cushion there in your funds because that could come up. So oil and taxes are prorated. Paragraph B, title. It says that the seller is going to convey clear title by general warranty deed. It also goes on to talk about this is one time where closing can be automatically extended. So let's say they do the title search, they find a problem with the title. This does give the seller 60 days to fix the title. And it says the buyer is going to stay in the deal and give the seller those 60 days automatically. Now, sometimes you run into a situation that's so bad that both attorneys say, yep, this can't be fixed, and both parties can mutually agree to release each other from the contract. We had one of those in my office as well. But if you run into a typical, situation, maybe a line needs to be redrawn or something like that, then the buyer will agree to give the seller 60 days to fix the title. Paragraph C land use assessment. This talks about rollback taxes. Don't see it a whole lot. In rural areas you might, and it says the seller is responsible for those taxes. An example is a piece of farmland that's been taxed at a lower rate. Now maybe it's being sold, it's going to be used for something else. So there's back taxes that are being collected, and those would be the responsibility of the seller. Risk of loss talks about insurance, and it says the seller is going to keep insurance on the property up until the time of settlement. Paragraph E, equipment condition and inspection. This says that the seller is going to keep the property in the same condition that it was at the time the purchaser made the offer. So that means they're going to keep maintenance up on it. They're going to clean it. The level is described as broom clean condition. Common thing we see a lot of is in the summertime, people move out and don't cut the grass. It's expected that they would cut the grass that last time and have the place in good shape. I'll just give you a fair warning. Sometimes as the agent, you have to get involved in making sure some of that gets done. I had a client that he was selling an investment property, and we went over there before closing, and the attic was still full of junk. And his comment was, "Oh, well, that's been left over from tenants through the years." I was like, "Well, sir, that doesn't matter. You're selling this house now, so you need to get that cleaned out." So I had to get a couple young fellas in my vehicle over there, and we were hauling stuff out of there to the dump. So as a listing agent, you have to make sure your seller's leaving the property in the right condition. And sometimes even as the buyer's agent, you get involved in making things happen. We've also heard the horror stories of people taking things they weren't supposed to take and all of that. So that just stay on top of that. That's the paragraph that also gives you the right to go back and do your walkthrough. You will do your walkthrough with your buyer before closing. All right, paragraphs F, G, and H work hand in hand. F and G refer to your well, septic, or municipal systems, and G is your wood infestation or termites, and H talks about the dollar limit of responsibility for those. Those two items are separate and apart from the home inspection, and per our contract, they are the responsibility of the seller. Again, everything's up for negotiation. You can negotiate to do that differently. But per our contract, the seller is responsible for well and septic and termite inspections. Now in paragraph F, they've added that you check whether it's a well or municipal, which is public water, and whether it's a septic or public sewer. And I've noticed people, especially if it is public, they tend to skip over that box. Be careful, don't skip any of these boxes. They all have implications. So you just check which of those is the service for the property. You can determine that from MLS. The next paragraph talks about if it is a well and or a septic system, excuse me, which inspections you want to have done. Now, of course, as the buyer, you want the most inspections done, and as the seller, you want the least. So this could become a point of negotiation as well. Typically, I see buyers asking for those first two boxes to be checked, visual inspection and pumping the contents. But sometimes the seller may respond, well, we just had it done and we can provide you documentation. And if your buyer's okay with that, that's fine. Just change the contract to say that. That could be on the other, and then have everyone sign off on that. Paragraph H is the termite inspection. Again, that's responsibility of the seller, and all of these need to be done within 30 days of closing, which is we're closing most deals in 30 days now anyway. Now, paragraph H is where you talk about the dollar amounts that the seller is going to automatically cover if they find anything from those inspections, well, septic, termite. And as I said, this is over and above the home inspection. If you leave it blank, the default amount is $1,000. I'm now starting to see people write higher amounts in that blank if it's a septic system. I used to only say, oh, if you're worried about termites, you might want to up it. But I'm seeing more and more with older homes and septic, and maybe the the distribution box or one of the boxes is in a place that's hard to get to, so it's more involved. Maybe a driveway's having to be dug up or something like that. So again, it's property specific, it's situation specific. If you think there may be more cost involved, or maybe it's an older system, you might want to up that even in your initial offer to where you want the seller to cover $3,000 of things like that. Just that way, that's kind of taken off the table from the beginning. The seller will know. They will think, oh yeah, well, I know I've taken good care of things, it's going to be all right, and they won't care if it's a higher amount. Or they may think, okay, am I willing to accept that? There might be a problem with my septic. But just be aware of that. If you're kind of worried about well, septic, termite, you might want to consider putting a higher limit there. Paragraph I is specifically referring to VA and FHA loans, and it's just stressing one more time that for those type of loans, the house must appraise for the purchase price value. Paragraph J is standard language referring to mechanics liens. It's universal across the United States. It says that anyone who has done work on the property and not been paid has 90 days to put a lien against the property. So this kind of relates to the home inspection. Let's say some repairs were being done, and anybody who did that work has the right to put a lien on the property if they didn't get paid. So you tell your buyer the way we prevent that, a couple ways. You're going to have a title search done, and also before we do our walkthrough, we're going to ask for those paid receipts. If some work was done, we want the seller to give us those paid receipts so that we can see the work was actually paid for, so we don't have to worry about that. Paragraph K is non-binding mediation. Now everybody thinks mediation is this nice soft word that is just everybody sitting around being nice around a table. It's not that at all. It is still a legal process. It still has cost with it. It is just not a lawsuit in front of a judge. So it is something to be taken seriously. But all this is saying is we will do mediation before we file a lawsuit if we run into a problem of getting the contract executed. Paragraph L, miscellaneous. It's just what it says. It covers a couple of important things. As I've already stated, this document is the entire agreement. There can be no verbal agreements. I don't care if the seller or the listing agent says, oh yeah, we're going to leave you that lawnmower, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. If it's important to your client, it needs to be in writing, either in the contract or in an addendum. Do not take anybody's word for it. If it's not on paper, it's not written the way your client expects it to happen, you cannot enforce it. So remember that. And it can only be changed in writing. So that's what an addendum is for. Okay. It also gives you the definition of a day. It says a day will mean a calendar day unless noted, and the first day will be the day following the commencement of a time period. Paragraph 25 is the seller representation. That just says that the seller includes all persons possessing an ownership interest in the property. Again, that's one of those things that sounds pretty obvious, but you could have a piece of property that's owned by 5 or 6 heirs. You've got to make sure that all people have signed the contract, and the sellers signing this are making a representation that that's true. Paragraph 26 says that everyone, buyer and seller, is in agreement that electronic signatures can be used. You really need to make sure you learn how to do electronic signatures. It will make your life so much easier. Paragraph 27 is acceptance. When you make your offer, you're going to decide how long you give the seller to respond. So you mark AM or PM and you put a certain date. We saw some crazy things this spring. I received an offer and they wanted an answer in 6 hours because they were trying to be the first person in. It was a competitive situation. They wanted an answer. In my opinion, that's ridiculous. You just have to realize you're working in the real world. Sellers have jobs, sellers can be out of town, and I just think that's, not practical, and it's kind of rude. Typically, we see at least 24 hours, sometimes 2 to 3 days. That's where you as one agent want to talk to the listing agent, kind of see what's going on. You've probably noticed in MLS, it may say if the property comes on the market Thursday or Friday, it may even have some instructions, like we're doing an open house Saturday, all offers will be reviewed Sunday at 7. especially if they think it's a hot property and they're going to get lots of offers. A lot of agents are doing it that way. So it will be, again, situation specific, be reasonable. The other thing you need to remember, let's say you make your offer and it goes back and forth a few days and you don't get it signed off until the 15th. If your initial offer said this is void after the 12th, go in and change that date. You want your final signature date and this counteroffer date to sync up. So just change that date, have everyone initial, and make sure everything's in sync. And then the next paragraph I'd already talked about, I can't stress enough, ratification and delivery means just that. It's when you've gotten all the initials and you've gotten it back to the other side. You would hate for your client to lose out on the property because you've left something sitting in your email and someone else swooped in and beat you out on a particular property. It's another great reason for using electronic signatures. You can set everybody up on the transaction. As soon as that last initial is done, everybody who needs a copy gets a copy, and then it's done. Okay? Everybody needs to sign. If you need more signature lines than that, you can just add more lines. And then at the very bottom of the page where it asks for the two brokers' information, complete that information. It's nothing official. It's really information that the lender needs. It just makes their life easier. If they have to go tracking it down, it just slows down the process. We want things to go smoothly, so anything we can do to help out the lender just keeps things rolling along. So that's it. It's a lot of information. Just can't stress enough, you need to read this, you need to get familiar with it, practice filling it out, practice with your own house. Pick a house in MLS, pretend you're making an offer. I would practice filling it out manually, I would practice filling it out online. Meet with your manager, ask any questions about things you don't understand. You really don't want the first time you fill this out to be when you're with a client. And you're gonna, I get those calls all the time, 8 o'clock Friday night, somebody's calling in a panic because they don't remember how to do something. The more you practice, the better you'll get at it. We're here to help. We want to answer your questions. We want to help you write good contracts. Thanks a lot.